Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for attending our webinar today on cultural mismatch in the classroom and supporting ELL students. Your presenter today is Ashley Coombs. Ashley is a third-year school psychology student at the University of Utah, and she is also the webinar coordinator for the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Education and Mental Health webinar series. She is passionate about social justice advocacy and promoting equitable educational practices. Before I turn it over to Ashley, just want to go over a few key reminders. The presentation will run about 50 minutes. We will have a question and answer session about 5 to 10 minutes at the end. So if you have a question you would like to submit, feel free to pop that in the chat box, or you can wait until the end to ask. Please mute your sound throughout the whole presentation. And if you're comfortable, feel free to turn on your video. Last but not least, we do have an ASL interpreter for today's webinar, which is really cool. So you can feel free to pin the interpreter on your screen for your convenience. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Ashley.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Annie. I am so excited that you are here joining us for our third installment in our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Education and Mental Health webinar series. If you haven't seen our previous two webinars, go check those out on our lab website, and also keep an eye out for presentations that will be happening after winter break. So let me pull my presentation up here real quick. So we're going to be talking about cultural mismatch in the classroom and specifically how that relates to supporting ELL students. And so before I even get started, I want to give a really big thank you to these two people on my screen, Josephine Clark and Annie Maldonado. Josephine is a school counselor in an elementary school here in Utah. She has her ESL endorsement. And Annie is a school psychology doctoral program, school psychology doctoral student here in our program. And these two were super helpful in coming up with content and developing content for this presentation, because Josephine works directly with ELL students on a regular basis. And Annie's family came to the United States from Puerto Rico when she was in school. And so she has firsthand experience at what it's like being an English language learner in our American school system. So just they weren't able to join us live, unfortunately, but their remarks and their input has been very, very helpful in kind of navigating what it's like to work with students and experience school when your native language is not what you're being taught. So let's jump in. First of all, I have up here, this is from the National Center for Education Statistics. This is distribution of students by race and ethnicity enrolled in public school. It compares fall 2009 to 2018. I'm going to be talking about the 2018 statistics. So we'll be looking at these light green bars over here. But as you can see, 47% of our student population is white, which means that we have a majority minority student population. So over half of our student population enrolled in public school in the United States belong to racial and ethnic minority groups, which is really, really interesting considering these stats. This is the distribution of our teachers in public school in the United States. Also, again, comparing previous years to 2017 to 2018 school year. But we see overwhelmingly that our teachers out in the field are white. And so why does this matter? Why is this a big deal? Why do we care at all the race and ethnicity of our students, of our teachers? Why does that impact anything? It impacts a lot, is the bottom line. So when we have, again, we can go back to this slide, a really diverse student population who are being primarily taught by white teachers, there's something that happens in that the dominant culture of the school becomes very much driven by the teachers and administration that we have leading the schools. And so we have a culture of the school that doesn't necessarily match the culture of our students' homes and families, which is something that we call cultural mismatch. So again, cultural mismatch is referring to the culture of a child's home and their family being different from the culture of their school. So what are we even talking about when we're talking about culture? Here's just a fun little infographic of our culture wheel. And so I think when people are talking about culture, a lot of things that come up are things like food and clothing and holidays and things like kind of sometimes language. But there are a lot of factors and aspects of cultural differences, things like values, language, yes, and also just communication style, traditions, experiences with the community, and the things that we value as skills and tools and other things like that. So there are a lot of things that contribute to what we consider culture. And so again, when we have a dominant culture that is driven by teachers who are white, we're going to have some inconsistencies with students who do not belong to that racial and ethnic group. So this leads into a problem of ethnocentrism. I can't even talk. Ethnocentrism. So ethnocentrism is referring to this tendency to evaluate other cultures by our own standards and our own expectations developed by our own culture. And so again, we have this dominant culture that is what we use to judge the behavior, the academic achievement, all of these other things that we expect from students in school that are impacted by their own culture. So we're judging that by the dominant culture. So why does this matter still? Because we have influences on behavior, influences on academic achievement, and influences on well-being. Oh, all right. So this impact on behavior leads to disproportionalities in discipline. It leads to an achievement gap, and it leads to distress in our students and negative life outcomes. So these are things that are not good. We want to avoid these things. But unless we are very cognizant of the way that culture interacts with these things, we're not going to be addressing any of these larger issues. So in general, racial and ethnic minority students are disciplined at higher rates and are overrepresented in school discipline. This is especially true for Black students. So Black students are more likely to be disciplined for subjective offenses. So things like disrespect, noncompliance, defiance, anything that requires a teacher to make a subjective judgment of their behavior, as opposed to using some sort of like set criteria. So compare that to, disrespect to property destruction. So one has a very clear criteria and expectation, and you can see what it looks like. And the other is just the teacher's personal interpretation of an interaction. Black students are also more likely to receive harsher punishments than white students for the same behavior. So we're seeing these disproportionate responses and disproportionate rates of discipline in very big ways for our minority students. So this is a chart from a report by the U.S. Government Accountability Office. It's from 2018. It is analyzing data from the 2013-2014 school year. It is really unfortunate that this data is not available or as often or updated as often as it should be, probably. But this gives us a really interesting idea of what discipline looks like in schools. So if we're looking at this, it's a lot to look at right off the bat. But what this is telling us is that students that are underrepresented, so these blue bars here on the left, that means that they are being disciplined, specifically suspended, at rates that are lower than what would be expected given the proportion of the student body that they make up. So white students, again, current statistics have them at less than half of our students. When this was released, they were about half of our student population. So despite making up 50% of the student population at the time, their rates of suspension were only about 32%. So we're seeing that they were suspended at rates lower than what we would expect. On the other side, we have Black students who only make up about, well, when this data was released, only made up about 16% of the student population, but they were being suspended at a much higher rate. So we see that there's a 23 percentage point difference from the proportion of the student body that they made up and the percentage of school suspensions that they made up. So if we were to look at this from a more intersectional lens, which I wish I had just 10 hours to talk about this nonstop, it would be so nice. But we're also seeing kind of similar trends for male students and students with disabilities. And so when we combine all of those identities, Black male students who are disabled, we're also seeing some really scary statistics on their discipline rates. So again, why does that matter? Like, shouldn't students be disciplined if they are, breaking rules? Why are we upset about this? Or why are we concerned about this? Well, for a lot of reasons. One is that we're not necessarily seeing the same kind of behavior across the board. Students with Black teachers are rated as less disruptive than students with non-Black teachers, and they are suspended less often. So we're seeing a disconnect here. We're not seeing the same rates with Black students with Black teachers versus Black students with white teachers. And so why is that? Another thing we're seeing is that students who had at least one Black teacher by the time they were in third grade were 13% more likely to attend college. And students that had two Black teachers by the time they were in third grade were 32% more likely to attend college. So something's happening here where Black students are thriving with Black teachers, and we're seeing some issues when they have non-Black teachers. Is that suggesting that you should only have a teacher who matches your same racial or ethnic identity? No. However, students who match their racial and ethnic background of the teachers, they often receive more positive behavioral evaluations and higher grades. So why is that? Probably because we are evaluating behavior and we are evaluating interactions from the perspective of our own cultural interpretation, of our own cultural background. So think of things like school rules, classroom rules, expectations for the schools. We have things like cute little acronyms, SOAR, self-control, on task, achievement, respect, things like be respectful, be responsible, be safe. These are fairly vague words because what it means to be respectful to one person is not going to be the same as it is to another person. And then you add in differences of cultural background. So I want you to take a minute to think about what you would consider appropriate behavior. What does that look like to you? In terms of eye contact, in terms of volume or tone or speed of your conversations, other things that I listed on here, common things that you might see in a school setting that can be impacted by your own cultural view of appropriate social interaction, social norms. So what do you consider appropriate behavior when it comes to class participation? Or what does attentive listening look like to you? What do you consider respect? How do you expect students to handle conflict? What do you consider appropriate in terms of building rapport? What do you think that educator-student relationship should look like? What does it mean for a student to be prepared? How should students ask questions? Like, these are all things that we tend to assert as just there's a normal way to act, there's an appropriate way to act in school, but those expectations or those standards of appropriateness are directly impacted by the dominant culture in the school, which, like we talked about, is white teachers. So my own experience, right? I am biracial, I am white, and I am Indigenous, and My mom is from LA. She's from a very low income area that is primarily Hispanic and Latino. And our family communication styles, when we are with her family, we are loud and we talk quickly and you are interrupting people. And that's just how conversations go. It's not considered rude in any way. It's not considered disrespectful, at least within my family culture that is impacted by, our area, our racial and ethnic background. So all of those things, that's just normal. Those are socially appropriate behaviors to engage in within that context. But then pick up those same expectations and put them in a classroom where we have inside voices, where we raise our hand, where, we are taking turns, things like that. And it's not that those things are inherently bad or that those things are inherently discriminatory, but if we are not considering the cultural context of the student who's engaging in what we would consider disruptive behavior or violating these social norms of appropriate behavior, we're really doing these students a disservice. If a teacher was to get very mad at me for talking loudly when that is how we talk at home and that is how we communicate at home, we are encouraging a disconnect and fostering this dissonance between school culture and family culture, or school culture and home culture. Okay, so rewind back to suspension rates, right? So we have Black students specifically, but students of racial and ethnic minority backgrounds who are suspended at higher rates. Why is exclusionary discipline a big deal? It's because it's correlated with poor grades. It's correlated with dropping out entirely, low educational attainment as an adult, and most importantly, I think, involvement with the criminal justice system. So that's arrest, that's incarceration. So when we are excluding students from school, or we are referring students to law enforcement, we are setting them on this path. You may be familiar with the term the school to prison pipeline, for future interactions with law enforcement, for future involvement with the criminal justice system. And what's really interesting about this as well is that students who attend schools that have really high suspension rates are also more at greater risk for these things. Even if the student themselves is not suspended, creating a school climate that perpetuates these stereotypes also puts all students at risk. Okay, so let's take a second to look at Utah graduation rates specifically. So most recent 2020 over here on the right, at kind of first glance, it's like, okay, that looks all right. But then we compare our Caucasian students who are graduating at a rate of about 91%. to our Black students who are graduating at a rate of 79%, or our American Indian students at about 73%. Our English language learners, 73%. That's a pretty significant difference that we are seeing, specifically in the context of our own state, discrepancies in academic achievement. So let's talk about how that relates to teacher bias. Oops, I think I skipped a couple slides. Okay, we will get to teacher bias. But first, let's talk about, teacher bias. How does this relate to these moving from behavior into academic achievement and academic expectations for students? How does this impact what we're seeing, these concerns that we're seeing? Well, first of all, you see assumptions that behavior problems and academic achievement gaps or intelligence are just inherent and they are directly related to these racial and ethnic identities. I remember sitting in a class in my undergrad and being told by a professor that there are innate differences in intelligence between racial groups, and that was it. No context, no consideration of socioeconomic factors and the impact of poverty on, development, or talking about intelligence assessments being culturally loaded. Like none of that was on the table. It was just presented as this fact that there are racial differences between groups of people. And as one of a very small, I can't even call us a handful because there were like 3 of us in this class, students who were not, or who belonged to racial and ethnic minority groups. It was deeply uncomfortable in the first place. It really impacted my perception of myself and my own competence and my own intelligence to be told by someone that I considered, an expert in this area, you are inherently less intelligent because you belong to this group. And then in addition to that, there was concern that I was sitting in a room full of people who do not belong to these minority groups, who are just going to go out into the world and accept that as fact, and that's going to inform their practice as psychology undergraduate students. I don't know where they were going to go, if they were going to go into, being a therapist or doing assessment. This information could directly impact and inform their worldview and their perception of students who belong to these groups. In addition to that, this is going to, if you believe some of these stereotypes, you believe that, students just inherently have these behavior problems if they belong to these groups, that's going to affect the way you interact with students. It's going to affect grading practices, and it's going to affect learning expectations. I can't tell you how many times I've sat in meetings with teachers or overheard teachers talking about these people who from other countries who don't value education or who don't teach their kids how to behave. And, it's again, so driven by this idea of what is considered appropriate that excludes any cultural factors or any cultural differences and disadvantages these students from the get-go. Okay, so this is from the Department of Education, United States, and it is looking at reading scores of 8th grade ELL students. Again, this is not super recent data, but it's hard to find. I can't tell you how long I scoured these websites to try and find more accurate data being reported by the government or by educational agencies. It's not good stuff, which makes it really hard to address these issues. Also, if we're not, we're not being given access to more recent data on these things. But looking at this, so this is again reading scores of 8th grade students. You compare the non-ELL students up there on the top in blue to ELL students below in black, and there is a pretty consistent discrepancy there. So we are seeing that there is a difference in achievement. And again, you might encounter people in schools that say that is just inherent. ELL students just are not going to achieve as high of scores or get as good of grades as students whose native language is English. There will be that attitude. I've heard it. You'll probably encounter it. But that becomes a problem so we have our students that are trying to do 2 things at once. They're trying to learn new material while also learning English. So we are going to see the low academic achievement. That can cause psychological distress. It can negatively impact emotional well-being, because in relation to this poor performance, and then knowing that your teachers just think you're less intelligent, you're less competent, they have lower expectations for you, where is the motivation to perform higher? So you're going to see additional discrepancies in achievement related to these lower expectations. So that relates to something called the stereotype threat, which you may also be familiar with. And so this is essentially describing this experience of students being, or the academic performance of students being negatively impacted by reminders that they belong to a group that already has a stereotype of being academically inferior. So it is really difficult to try and care about learning in an environment where just off the bat, People don't think you're as intelligent. People don't think you're as capable. And so this also relates to another concept of self-efficacy. So this, a student's confidence in their abilities to achieve certain things, goals, outcomes, grades, do well on tests and assignments. And so we're creating this environment that is not very conducive to emotional well-being. So this is where chatting with my good friend Annie about her experience being an ELL student. So she told me something that just was the quote up here. So, does not being able to talk to you make me seem like I'm not smart? And, just thinking about how heavy that would be to carry as a child, is that I can't communicate and everyone around me thinks that I am incompetent. Everyone around me does not know that I am a unique person with a rich inner life and experience because I can't communicate that. And those barriers can have really negative impacts. So, again, chatting with Annie about what it was like to integrate into general education. What did that experience actually look like? What are students actually going through? First off the bat, she talked about a lack of inclusive teaching strategies, that oftentimes she was given just a complete lack of guidance. She was paired off with another student. The student wasn't given any guidance either. And so in an attempt to not cause problems or to try and not have to show how hard this experience is, it would result in copying off of somebody else's paper because there was just again, little guidance. Other things that would have been a really easy accommodation were visual aids that a lot of teachers just weren't willing or didn't even consider to provide. Additionally, there was the issue of a lack of social support. So feeling excluded just by nature, again, of not being able to communicate with your peers. Then there's an additional factor of fear and avoidance and anxiety and trying to fit in with a new, not only a new culture, but trying to make friends, trying to build relationships with a teacher. Another quote I have on here is that teachers don't know me and they can't get to know me because they can't talk to me. And so in attempts to fit in, you'll see some students who will just abandon their native language entirely. They'll abandon their culture entirely. And this can create some additional issues with feeling guilty, with feeling this disconnect from their home and their school and trying to manage these two seemingly incompatible experiences. And so there is on top of already trying to learn a new language and on top of all of the academic aspects, there is a lot of emotional burden that is being held by these students who are trying to navigate this space and they don't have the social support to do it. So I want to talk a little bit about dual immersion schools. So my mom works at one. She's fantastic. She works at a dual immersion Spanish speaking elementary school. It's also a Title I school, and they serve their student population is primarily Hispanic and Latino. And so what she has told me and has expressed about loving about her school is that there are equal footing for students. So students get to speak in English sometimes, and that's hard for the students trying to learn English. And then students get to speak in Spanish sometimes, and that's hard for the students trying to speak Spanish. And so there's this community of learning together. You have teachers who speak English and Spanish, who students that are really struggling in English still have someone that they can talk to. They see teachers that look like them, like we talked about earlier with our Black students who thrive in classrooms where their teachers recognize their cultural differences and recognize and validate those differences in communication and behavior. It is an invaluable experience to see yourself represented and to fight against those negative stereotypes associated with belonging to a racial or ethnic minority group. And so being able to celebrate your culture in a way that that helps you express how important it is to you, that you don't have to give that identity away, and that other students also get to learn from you. You're not just in this position of being behind everybody else, but being able to teach your classmates something as well. Okay, so there's a study on ELL self-perception. It also talks about perception of teachers, what ELL students in this study considered attributes of a good teacher and of a bad teacher, or things that were helpful for them versus were really not helpful. And so some of these things that they identified in good teachers were teachers that were encouraging, teachers who could relate, teachers who listened, who helped to understand, that could explain things if they didn't understand, and were willing to explain things if they didn't understand, teachers who could provide step-by-step instructions, and were willing to slow down their speech and their writing to accommodate, versus teachers that students in this study didn't really like, did things like expressed negative behavior or made negative comments about students or about their racial and ethnic minority group. Teachers who were closed-minded, who avoided interacting with the students entirely, who weren't willing to provide proper instruction or provide accommodations, and teachers who set unrealistic expectations. So in response to this negative teacher behavior, the ELL students reported perceptions of receiving bad grades. They felt incompetent, that they were doing worse than everybody else. They were afraid of failing. They were afraid of feeling dumb. They felt like a nuisance, and they felt that they were not equal as people. They were not equal with their peers. They also expressed that when they were neglected, whether socially, whether academically, they didn't feel like they belonged in school. There were feelings of feeling lost, offended, embarrassed, confused. They felt that they were treated poorly. And so, as a result of all of those things, it's really hard to care about your education. Related to what we talked about earlier, that when there are these lower expectations combined with all of these really negative experiences, it's hard to care. It is hard to care about doing a math assignment when you are not accepted at your school or you are not supported at your school. On the flip side, compare that to positive teacher behavior, encouragement. They reported feeling proud of themselves, determined to succeed. They felt like they had a purpose. They reported feeling not dumb. They felt confident that they were able to learn, that they were hopeful. And so when they received that encouragement, they were more likely to succeed. Because again, consider the effects that this has on your perception of yourself. Everyone thinks that I am incompetent. I guess I must be. I guess I don't care. Versus having a teacher who can respond to you in a way that is encouraging, regardless of whether you can complete the assignment, or regardless of whether you get a good grade on a test. But that can encourage and motivate you to want to feel better about yourself, to feel better about those things in particular. So this is Josephine. So I'm going to play this video for you really quick, where she's talking about her experience working with ELL students on the ground. I think that obviously research is great, but I think that there are some experiences that we really have to hear it directly from people. And, you know, I was really wanted to emphasize practitioners who are on the ground that are working with students. And also, like I said, I talked with Annie quite a bit about her personal experience. And so this is Josephine talking about some things that she's found helpful in working with ELL students.
Yeah, and so kind of going back to helping ELs in the classroom, I just wanted to share a couple of experiences of some of my students in the high school level. So every year I would get students from different countries, and my EL students were probably the hardest working students because they had the main challenge of the language barrier that they had to try and navigate. And then they also had because they would come from another country, their credits wouldn't always transfer. So they would come deficient in credit as well. So they had to catch up on all that credit while also trying to take classes in a language that they don't know. And so our graduation rate for our English language learners was actually pretty high. And I feel like it's because the school counselors and the teachers at my school really tried to accommodate and meet their needs and just encourage them. Like that was the biggest thing. Like I had a student who the first day of school was so scared, was like visibly shaking because, you know, he didn't know the language and he already had some anxiety. So that added more to it. But I put him in like a choir class. And that was his favorite class because he was learning English by singing it, and just kind of, for some reason, it helped with his pronunciation as well of certain words. And he just talked about his teacher so highly that, you know, his teacher was loving and encouraging and just connected with him in a way that really helped him have confidence to join other things in the school. So he ended up doing choir, an advanced choir the following year, and then was in a bunch of clubs. And there's several experiences like that. So I think when teachers actually see students and they acknowledge them, and especially our L's in the classroom, we can kind of sometimes become invisible or just partner up with a buddy, and then the buddy just translates everything to the student. It's like the teacher doesn't have that one-on-one interaction. And so, you know, students can tell when you're being genuine and you really care about them. So I think coming from a place of love, and I don't want to say that in a cheesy way or like break any rules, but like you know, they need that too, you know, they need that support at the school.
Yeah,
so.
Absolutely. Awesome.
Perfect. So yeah, that was just her kind of additional input in what it's been like to work with students. And, you know, I think just being seen in general, wanting people to know you, to see you, to understand you, is just something that people want in general. And when there is that additional factor of teachers not making an effort to understand your cultural background, your language, or to assist in accommodating language barriers, it really contributes to, again, feeling unseen. Okay, oops. There we go. And so in addition to experiences that students might have themselves, we also see some barriers to parent involvement. Again, like I mentioned, I have heard teachers locally who have made comments suggesting that parents don't discipline, or that people from this country are lazy and don't value education, and really just perpetuating negative stereotypes, which, like we've already talked about, impacts the way they interact with their students, but also really just sets parents up for not being able to be involved in their child's education the way they want to. Because again, there are also these stereotypes that they have to navigate. So some of those things that may make it difficult for parents to engage in schools or in their child's education. First of all, academic jargon. We use a lot of acronyms in education. We use a lot of fairly technical language. And so if that's completely unfamiliar, how do you even begin to know what you don't know, right? I mean, I can't keep up with acronyms. I feel like I'm being introduced to a new one every time I show up to one of my schools. And so when there's not a perfect translation for that either, and it's a concept that is not consistent across states, first of all, but also across countries, it poses some difficulties to being able to understand. And then also poorly translated materials, just taking an English document, putting it right into Google Translate without consulting anyone who actually speaks that language. It obviously obviously they don't care enough to try and provide accurate materials, or obviously, that doesn't foster a relationship of trust, or encourage any sort of genuine relationships between school and home. Another thing is just communication gaps between teachers and students or parents in general. So are parents able to get regular updates about their child's performance? Do teachers make the effort to do that? How detailed are they being when there is a language barrier? Are teachers attempting to be accommodating in that way? I'm sure a lot of them are. I've also encountered a lot that don't. Another thing is access to translators. Do we have quality translators? Are we pulling in another student to try and help interact with the student, which can be really helpful sometimes, but when we're trying to convey information to parents and we're not willing to bring in a professional translator or bring in somebody that can really assist and support, then again, we are not accommodating that in a way that is actually helpful or actually beneficial. Another thing is inadequate district ELL plans. Do we have plans within our school district on how to support English language learners? What does that system look like? Do teachers actually implement those things? And go back up to the academic jargon. Do parents know what that plan is? Do they know, and is it being communicated to them what is being provided, what supports are being provided for their child? Another thing that you have to consider is technology literacy, internet access. When we have refugee students that are coming from a country that with a very volatile political climate, and we say, here's a Chromebook, go to work. What are we doing to support those families and support those parents in helping their students? So these are all things that are very easy to forget about, all things that are very easy to not acknowledge unless you are actively aware of the ways that we are disadvantaging families that do not belong to our dominant culture. Okay, other things are just school culture in general. What is the role of the teacher? Is that different from the country that a family moved from compared to here? Communication expectations. Something that Annie and I talked about was that she said her school's in Puerto Rico, your parents could just show up and talk to the principal, and that was perfectly fine and acceptable. And so when faced with this expectation to call and make appointments or use an online scheduling tool or all of these really complicated processes, that's very intimidating. And so being aware of the ways, again, that we are putting barriers up for families. Social community support. It's not only the student who is having to make friends, to make connections. Families as a whole, especially when they are immigrant families, trying to settle into their own community, create their own social support network. Do they have that community support? And additionally, financial support. We have to also look at socioeconomic status. Again, this is particularly relevant with our refugee families. Do we have, or just immigrant families in general, do we have parents who are required to work multiple jobs to support their families? And are we interpreting that lack of availability to come to class parties as not caring about their child's education? So again, just being really aware of how these things can come up. Because it is very easy to not think twice about having to call and make an appointment with your child's teacher or call and make an appointment with the principal of the school. That's something that for people who are familiar with the school culture or who the school culture reflects their own culture, not a big deal. That's not something that would even cross your mind unless that's something that you are making a conscious effort to address in an equitable way. Okay, so tying all of these things together, positive school climate and feelings of belonging, whether that is for all of our students, but especially our students who belong to racial and ethnic minority groups and our students who are learning English. So fostering a positive school climate and helping students feel like they belong at their school, academic success, student engagement, increased self-esteem. These are good things compared to those really negative outcomes that we talked about earlier and those feelings of distress and those feelings of incompetency and all of those other things that contribute to a more negative self-perception. So we can fix this. We can address and help these students if we are aware of the ways in which we are disadvantaging them in the first place. So other things that you can do as educators or as related service providers is, first of all, be flexible, have a variety of activities, opportunities for learning, strategies like visual aids that can accommodate all of your students, first of all, but that really take the time to address and accommodate our students who may have language, cultural barriers to their academic success. Other things, be encouraging. We talked about how ELL students respond to teachers that they perceive as encouraging and who make attempts to understand them. Those were all positive things. All of those feelings that promoted were all positive things that we want to see in our students. And so make an active effort to do those things, to encourage, to help students feel like they belong and that they are understood and that they are seen in your classroom or in your school or in your office, whatever capacity that you are working with them in. Other things, this is a suggestion that Annie gave me, was that allowing students to practice English in a way that is safe. So she mentioned really enjoying writing in her journal because nobody was judging her English in the moment. She was able to reflect and get feedback, and it wasn't quite as anxiety inducing as some other activities. Other things that were helpful is discussions with peer groups, being able to practice communication with a lot of people or with your peers. And so just creating opportunities to do that in a way that is safe. Other things is be open to learning and to feedback. If there is something that you realize that you are doing that is unintentionally disadvantaging students with different cultural backgrounds, or someone gives you feedback that's something that you're doing, that doesn't mean that you are a bad person. It does not mean that you are a bad teacher or you are bad at your job or that something is wrong with the way you are existing in the world. But we have to be open to feedback. We have to be able to separate that from our own tendency to not respond well to criticism, in that we can't improve without being willing to accept feedback. Additionally, being willing to examine and address our own biases. Other things are avoiding responses to students that are dismissive, that are minimizing, that are colorblind. Prioritizing rapport and relationships. Again, with students, we really want to make sure that they know that they are valued, that their culture is valued, and that they do belong at our schools. Other things is advocate for change. This could be at a local level, at your local school. This could be on a statewide policy level. But what are the ELL plans for your school district, for your school? What kind of SEL instruction is being provided? I know that's been a hot topic in the news lately here, but we can advocate for policy change in that regard as well. PBIS, so those school-wide practices that we are developing school rules and school expectations that are culturally responsive, that we are getting the input of our community, that we are not excluding these parents and excluding our community members by relying too heavily on the dominant culture of our school staff. And then additionally, community outreach. So lastly, I just want to share an app that Josephine shared with me called Talking Points. And this is basically a texting app that you can use to translate and communicate with parents. There's like a variety of, I checked, it's really cool. So things like this are out there. We can accommodate in ways that are, this seems very easy, right? This is something that does not take a whole lot of effort to implement, and yet we are creating space to include these families in our practices. So, all right, thank you so much. And if there are any questions. Perfect. Well, we are a small group, but I'm so glad that you joined us today. And so, yeah, thank you for being here. Keep an eye out for future webinars after winter break, and have a great rest of your day, everyone.